Would you rather be super emotionally charged or totally emotionally numb? Hi, welcome to the Authentic Action Podcast. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Miss Angel Lily. You can call me Auntie Angel if you like. And today I want to talk about balancing our emotions. It's a topic I've been writing about for some years now. And my book, The Shift, still almost finished. And one of the things that comes up very often as I've been working on the book and also just in my own life is this tension between being overly emotional and being emotionally like dead inside. And in our modern, rapidly shifting society, we tend to think of being overly emotional as a bad thing. And I would agree, being dysregulated, which is what we often think of when we say emotional or overly emotional, um, is not a being, dysregulated is not a good state to make choices from or to operate from in life. It's both toxic in the body and very ineffective for navigating ourselves towards our goals. And I think less acknowledged is this fact that being suppressed, emotionally repressed or suppressed being consciously pushing down our emotions, and repressed being unconsciously pushing down our emotions, which I think is like the modus operandi of our current culture. This is what leads to a life feeling devoid of meaning, relationships that don't feel connected, uh, wondering what is the freaking point anyway? Anybody feel me? I certainly have my rounds with this, and I also happen to be, thankfully, a highly emotional, highly sensitive type of person. And let me just give some expansion to that label that I just cast upon myself, because again, I think it is so common to think of being emotional as a negative thing for men and for women. I think women get a little more leeway to be emotional. And at the same time, we're also dismissed for being emotionally emotional more rapidly in many ways. Like we're not really allowed, speaking generally, of course, women are generally not thought of to be like it's generally not thought of to be acceptable to be angry, for example, whereas men are more generally not not thought of to be accepted as being sensitive or sad, for example, or um, overreactive. So um, all that put on the table, let's dive into it a little bit more. Um, as I was trying to get at. I think that either extreme, either being too emotionally supercharged or being dead inside, neither of those extremes is optimal. And a big part of the mission that I feel driven to try to bring to the world and to my own life is about this balancing act between feeling a lot and not feeling at all, or feeling too much and feeling too little. Because I do think that either of those extremes is not optimal. And I also think that in our attempt to not go to either of those extremes, we often overcorrect and um, tend to either completely shut down our emotions or completely over dive into them to such an extent that it can be overwhelming, or just um, it's like a wrecking ball, or a bull in a china shop, as they say. And I ran into a meme recently that I wanted to share, which I think is apropos, which is feelings are like children. They shouldn't be allowed to drive the van, but you also don't want to necessarily lock them in the trunk. And I think that's a great way to think about our emotions or our feelings. Little pinky finger asterisk. I define feelings as the conscious stories that we tell about our emotions, and emotions as chemical, neurochemical, neuro just meaning like in the mind. So chemical data that happens in our body that then gets translated in our conscious mind as feelings. And we think, oh, I feel agitated, or I feel angry, or I feel sad, or I feel joyful. Even if we don't have that conscious thought, if we were to reflect on how we feel, we might tell that story about it. And that, to me, is feelings. So to me, feelings are the story that we tell about emotions. Emotions are data based on chemical reactions, which we don't have, aren't in the language. So feelings are, to me, the our own like interpretive or translative mechanism for making sense of our emotions, or all that chemical data, che- che- chemistry data. I'm not saying that right, but I think hopefully you know what I mean. Um, I just lay down that definition because many of us use feelings and emotions interchangeably. I'm guilty of this as well, but for the purposes of my book and for many parts of my conversations lately, I try to make a distinction because I do think there is a difference. So back to having um, too many. So I started off calling it emotions, and now I want to flip flop over to calling it feelings. So just to demonstrate the very point that I was making a second ago, which is that we do tend to interchange them, and it is confusing. And in my many years of research about emotions and neurochemistry and feelings, I have found that the more we learn, the more we don't know, or the more questions we have, as is the case with any rabbit hole that I've ever gone down. So, if we have a lot of feelings and we're constantly telling stories about our feelings to ourselves and each other, it can really hamper our ability to navigate life. And again, as a highly sensitive person, I know this state of being very well, all too well, one might say. But hey, it's just part of who I am, and I'm ongoingly learning to accept and love who I am right now, for better and for worse. So one of my struggles, though, is to learn to not dive too headstrongly into my emotions. And again, I think this is a common struggle for many women. And I think for many men, the struggle to not shut down emotions is also common. And this is a very broad overgeneralization, and there are exceptions to every rule, so to speak, and there are certainly nuances on the spectrum of men and women, and feeling and not feeling abound. So I would just want to restate that, and you'll hear me restate that a lot, because a lot of the times when I'm trying to articulate my thoughts about these things, I'm aware that it might come off like I'm sounding one way or another, and um, just trying to clarify that I'm not trying to say that I think all men are a certain way, or all women are a certain way, or should be a certain way. I am simply using these general trends as examples. And indeed, there are these general trends. There are these stereotypes for a reason, and there are truths to them. And I would hypothesize that actually these truths are maybe truths isn't the right word, but these trends are more prominent than we might like to think a lot of the time. I guess I should just speak from my own framework and say, as a highly sensitive and yet also independent, strong woman who grew up what used to be called a tomboy, which apparently is not a term I'm supposed to use to even refer to myself anymore. And boy, pinky finger tangent asterisk, could we just could we just loosen up the reins on the rules about what we have to call everything? That's my vote because I think it gets a little ridiculous. Anyhow, that said, I still, it took me a lot of my childhood to come to terms with the term tomboy. I'm comfortable with it or was. Now I'm aware that it's now not a good suppose I don't even know. Let me back up out of that. Let me just try to back out of that big old cluttery hole of a mess and say that I feel like I exemplify some of the exceptions to being a female. And so I all the more reason why I'm not trying to say that any of us should fit into any specific kind of box. I'll leave that there because that's more than enough rambling about that. Back to the topic at hand, which is should we have more emotions or should we have fewer emotions? Or can we learn to straddle that seesaw of extremes and find a better balanced life and thereby live lives with more delicious meaning, more richness, more fullness, more connection in our relationships, while at the same time not being so like hot-headed and so, off the rail and so I mean, I like this. I like to be passionate and I like to, I'm flaring my hands around, making a lot of hand gestures. I once had somebody imitate me off the cuff and they did a lot of this. Apparently, it's a thing I do. Later, I've just recently come to find that that is a common trait of neurodivergent people. I don't know if that's a correlation or a causation or even just, either of those. Maybe it's just something that someone collected enough data to make a chart about that isn't actually true. So many things are like that, right? Um, Nonetheless, and also, I think it is true that personally, I feel best and I do best and I like to be around other people who are doing their best to balance those two. So, not to be totally avoidant and dead inside, and not to be totally over off the rail, spilling over all the time with emotions, but rather to be kind of like a seesaw with a I like the image of standing on a seesaw, but in the middle of the seesaw. So you're tipping it, but you're not over out on the edges, losing your balance or losing sight of that center. And to use that seesaw analogy, which I've used before, if the two sides are maintaining sight, you can actually get pretty far out and still have a good seesaw experience that's ultimately balanced, right? It's when we lose sight of that center point and we just try to like weigh, just add all the weight to one side that the whole thing falls apart. It either dies or it fries, as I like to say. Um, I was playing with that little saying earlier, which is don't get too energetically high and fry yourself, and don't get too energetically low and just die. Because I do think those are the the results of staying too long in either of those extremes. Again, in my own personal experience, which is just that, my own personal experience. So I think that emotions are what give our lives meaning. And in fact, there's some interesting research out there about people who've lost their ability to feel emotions and they cannot make decisions at all. They are completely dependent on others in order to live. So we really do need our feelings, our emotions, and then our feelings or the stories we're telling. And this is where I think we have a lot of room for improvement because I think that we humans have, and maybe I think at different points in history or even in different cultures currently, humans do a better job of interpreting emotions and telling better stories in the way of feelings. In the culture that I live in, which is the American, very westernized, propaganda enhanced or diminished culture, um, there is this superficialness that is happening that is increased dramatically in my lifetime, at least from my perspective, that is leaving many of us feeling devoid of a sense of meaning, feeling disconnected from life itself and from each other. And I think this is a result of this increasing constant drone of distraction in the way of social media, in the way of food, in the way of our the network news, which is now just a constant drip of r- emotional triggers, such that if you're exposing yourself to that, you really need to insulate yourself or shut down that response. And so it's a natural, I think it's the result of a natural healthy response that we end up shutting down our emotions because we're overstimulated emotionally. And so again, to use that seesaw analogy, we overcorrect and we end up going really far over into that shutdown to load close to death mode. And then sometimes that causes us to rise up, push back, rally. We get that pushback sense where we want to go no and get off the floor, and we have this huge surge of emotion and push back to the other way where we're amped up and we're off the rails. We're The problem with both of those is that they're too far in the extreme to really lead to a healthy, happy, um, functional life. And that's what I'm aiming for. I'm really aiming for it. I've been aiming for it my whole life. I've teetered in the balance point for long periods of time in this life. So I feel grateful for that. And I am, in fact, still teetering, but closer to solidly balanced in that midpoint this year than I was a couple years ago, for sure. It's been a turbulent time for humanity overall. I think that's safe to say, and it's worth pausing to say that that's normal, that's healthy. We're not alone. We're all in this together. It is natural that we feel unsure of how to navigate the future when the future is changing so rapidly. So I just want to give us all a little more grace in that. And at the same time, remind us all that it is as important as ever to maintain that balance, that ability to navigate with a clear mind and calm sense of meaning. So, not no meaning and not no emotion and not extreme chaotic emotion, but rather that balance, that midpoint where we are not completely anxious and we're not completely avoidant, but we're meeting in a dynamic dance between the two. And I should mention that doesn't mean that we're never anxious and we're never avoidant. It means that we're training ourselves to recognize in the same way that we dance between the feminine and the negative, the yin and the yang, day and night, dominant and submissive. The dance between being aware of a surge of emotion and being devoid of like being aware of a lack of emotion or a disconnection from our emotion. That's a natural dance. I don't think we should expect ourselves not to be dancing that dance or having some aspect of that swinging back and forth between those extremes given our current environment, both well, our external and our internal environments are correlated. They're intimately intertwined. So, on some level, the same thing, right? So, um, again, I don't think it's reasonable or fair to expect ourselves not to be navigating that bounce between the two sides of extremely emotional and extremely shut down. I do think that we can set our sights on that center point and keep aiming back toward that more balanced way of operating. And I know it's possible to reach it from either extreme because I personally have come back to center from both of those extremes. I've been extremely emotional and just explosive and spilling out all over the place in numerous ways on numerous occasions. And I've also been shut down and numbed out and, you know, feeding myself alcohol or drugs or television or negative, shitty stories in order to distract myself from actually dealing with the present moment, here and now. One of my favorite uh, thoughts, I was going to say a quote, but I don't remember the exact quote, but the thought behind the quote is that regardless of whether you're in very turbulent times or you're in calm times, the optimal state is the same to take care of the things you need to take care of your body, to take care of your relationships, to take care of the broader society, your family, the earth, as best you can, and to do your best and then do your best to sleep well at night. And if you can't sleep well at night sometimes, try not to lament that and waste any of your day lamenting that, but rather continue to do the best you can. As they say, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. I think that is one of the quotes that sums up that sentiment that I'm both feeling and trying to share with you because I think it's really important again in this time of rapid change, these times of rapid change. So many humans around me are expressing a sense of turbulence or a sense of just shutting down. And another quote I will throw on the table is a drowning man makes no sound. And I think it's important to remind each other and ourselves that if you're not hearing from someone, they're not out there spouting their emotions, it doesn't mean they're perfectly all right. It might mean that they're shut down and it might even mean that they're drowning. So I think it's so important for all of us to continue to hold ourselves accountable to aiming toward that midpoint, not getting too extreme in our emotions, and not shutting down so that we disconnect from our relationships, even with ourselves, so that we um, aren't able to find meaning and joy in our lives because if we're going to do that, what's the point, really? I think as we're bringing AI into the equation, um, which is so exciting on so many levels, it is, again, another reason to really bring to the forefront of our awareness how important it is to manage our emotions well. And that doesn't mean getting rid of them, and it also doesn't mean wallowing in them. It means just like the left and the right hemispheres of the brain work together to combine logic and feeling. And just like men and women can come together in that dynamic polarity dance to make new humans, and just like day and night work together to create the totality of our current existence here on Earth, I think that the dance between becoming self-aware about the messages that our body is sending us in the way of emotions and examining the interpretations that we are that we are making of those messages and making sure that those interpretations, AKA feelings, the stories that we're telling ourselves about the data that we're getting from our chemistry through our senses, those stories are often not true and they're often not serving us very well. And they're, right now, it feels to me at least like they're largely unconscious and they're largely submerged in old frameworks, an old paradigm that just is not serving us and in fact is in conflict at a lot of times with our current paradigm. Um, I don't have all the answers to any of this, but I do know that when I take time every day to tune myself to the present moment, essentially, but also to the energy in my own body, and this is both a personal and a universal experience, one which I have spent decades learning and practicing, and I enjoy teaching others to practice. So if you're interested in any of that, look me up, get on my website, get on my mailing list, and we can talk about that. Also, if you're interested in any of that, sign up for my mailing list and or check out my upcoming book, The Shift, which should be out very soon. When I say very soon, I don't know how soon that's going to be, but I am excited about it. It is coming together, and I do expect it to be a very helpful resource, a a toolbox of tools that anyone can use to help do exactly what I'm talking about, to use our emotions to create more meaning, to create more connection, and not to use them to wrecking ball to ruin things and not to use them to justify harming ourselves and others, and not to get rid of them such that we end up devoid of passion and feeling disconnected from our lives and each other. As I said, to not get too energetically high and fry and not get too energetically go too low and die. Like Icarus flying toward the sun or flying toward the waves. If we could just navigate at the right height, we could probably enjoy a little bit of high and a little bit of low and not crash and burn, not drowned. Keep this whole thing going a little bit longer. What do you think? Are you with me? I hope you are. I thank you if you are. I thank you for joining me today for this somewhat off the cuff, typical of me, unedited and unscripted Authentic Action podcast. I am still working on bringing back guests, and so you can look forward to that very, very soon. I do thank you for being you and let me be me. I welcome your questions, comments, interaction. You can find me on all the social media platforms and in particular on YouTube. And I encourage you to hit me up. Let's talk about feelings. Let's talk about emotions. Let's talk about balance. Let's talk about this great shifting that's going on between the old and busted and the new hotness. What do you think? You with me? That'll do it for now. I hope you're enjoying being you, whatever you're into, getting a little on ya. Peace.